Hi, Art 101ers. Let's start with some core concepts for this little discussion. First, today we're going to try to understand how and why art, and sculpture in particular, changed so drastically at the beginning of the 20th century. We'll also try to understand how that change influenced different aspects of the practice of sculpture, including these: material and medium, scale, subject matter, style, and context. And by context, we mean how we look at sculpture, including the places we see it and the times in which we see it, and the concept of time itself, which I think is an interesting one that we'll get to. So, in our previous discussions, we've seen how the ideas of ancient Greek sculptures persist in art and culture really throughout history. We've seen it influenced throughout the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and all the way up until the 19th century. In fact, here's a sculpture you might be familiar with. This is The Kiss by Auguste Rodin. We can see that even in the late 19th century, this is 1882, popular sculpture retains those Greek ideas: proportioned, lifelike figures, dramatic and dynamic poses, and representations of human ideals, right? In this case, it's love. In this case, it's wisdom, seen here in his most famous sculpture, The Thinker. So think about it. From about 400 BC up until 1900 or so, that's like 2,500 years, our major efforts in Western sculpture are surprisingly consistent. And then one day it just changes. That day was in 1917, when an artist named Marcel Duchamp walked into a gallery, set a porcelain urinal on its side, signed it with the nom de plume R. Mutt, and titled it Fountain. And presto, something he bought from Home Depot, or whatever the equivalent of Home Depot was at the time, that became a sculpture. It became fine art. One day we went from what we saw on the right to what we see on the left. It was a pretty radical change. Why did that happen? Well, let's look and see what Duchamp was doing. He had actually started a series of works that he called ready-mades. The first was, in fact, made from a bicycle wheel, as you can see here. So why was he making these? Well, he was one of the leading figures, Duchamp was, of a cultural movement known as Dada. Dada was, among other things, fervently anti-capitalist. It despised the excess and the exclusivity of the art market. And Duchamp's ready-mades were really meant to criticize and mock that. Duchamp famously claimed that they weren't meant to be art, they were meant to end art. Dada, broadly, really meant to be nothing short of a cultural revolution. But more deeply, I think Duchamp really meant to question the very nature of artistic practice itself. Now remember, this work follows a period in history known as the Industrial Revolution, when virtually everything on the market went from being a handcrafted, expertly made item to a factory-made, mass-produced item. Well, why not works of art? With his ready-mades, Duchamp really moved artfulness away from the exquisitely handmade object, and in that moved artfulness away from the appearance of the work to a consideration of the meaning of the object, regardless of how it came to be. That art became about meaning more so than about appearance is really one of the core concepts of modern art practice, and really Duchamp started this all. The artists around him immediately espoused the freedom of Duchamp's ideas. Like Picasso, as we can see here, artists were inspired to look beyond traditional materials and practices and really to investigate more meanings and concepts rather than creating imagery meant to represent ideals or virtues. One of Picasso's favorite motifs was the bull. He was an avid fan of bullfighting, and so here we see he makes a bull's head out of a rusty old bicycle handlebars and a seat. Other sculptors in the 20th century continue inventing new ways of making three-dimensional artworks and continue pushing the boundaries of what could be considered a sculpture or a work of art. Alexander Calder, one of my favorites, created a sculptural practice consisting entirely of baling wire. Well, that's all he did. He just bent baling wire into forms. And he formed both representational and abstract shapes. These, of course, are actually portraits, and it's a hard image to read, but that's actually wire hanging from another wire, I guess, in a gallery space. So the white behind it is actually just the wall of the gallery. So we would he would form this wire into these three-dimensional forms and allow them to float in the air from that wire. Now, the interesting thing about that is that uh, Alexander Calder actually invents the mobile, these things that we see today that are suspended over our baby cribs, and they were essentially invented by Calder because he called his sculptures mobiles because they were designed to sway and move in the breeze. His intention was that they were kinetic and they move by whatever physical forces they encounter. So with these, he really pioneers another consideration of 20th century sculpture, the relationship between the three-dimensional object and the world surrounding it. The sculpture was no longer a 3D illusion of a fabled or historic character standing there in front of you, right? Instead, it was actually a real-time, live, discrete and unique object, interacting with the space that you, the viewer, also inhabits, so that you can consider the ideas of the sculpture in real time. In a sort of simple way, the sculpture wasn't about the past anymore, right? It was about the present experience you were having looking at it. Now, like Calder, other sculptors challenged the conventions of the medium. In the mid-20th century, Joseph Cornell had a passion for art making, but he didn't have access to the large workspaces that a traditional sculptor would need, these giant studios that we all used to rent back in the day. In fact, he had a day job and lived with his mother in a small apartment in Queens. So every night after dinner, he would clean off the kitchen table, sit for the rest of the evening making small window box sculptures out of these secondhand materials. And really what he was doing is he challenged the idea that sculpture was a monumental practice made from permanent materials like stone or cast metal, that there were other kinds of sculpture to be made, not just these sort of giant metal or carved marble things. He used found objects, pictures cut from magazines, repurposed boxes and picture frames, and in that he creates an utterly unique form for his sculptures. And by form, I mean literally what the thing that we're looking at, right? That's the sort of artistic term for form. They no longer address grand ideals, but instead seem like glimpses into an interior space, into a small kitchen almost even. And I mean that both literally and figuratively, right? They're like little assemblies of dream imagery or little fanciful or sort of wandering thoughts. They seem like small ideas. They're not grand ideas. They're small ideas that he makes sculptures out of. So instead of this monumental sculpture meant to awe us, Cornell really makes this sort of intimate, like enigmatic, whimsical, and even precious kind of piece of art. And many people found that paradoxically powerful in the time. In fact, when I was in art school, we loved these because we were just like Cornell in that way, right? We didn't have grand studios and wealthy benefactors, which would allow us to make these sort of giant monumental sculptures. So for us students, it was really refreshing to know we could be serious artists working at our own kitchen tables, after work with the stuff that we found around the house. So even 50 years later, it was really an invigorating idea for young artists who were trying to become artists like Cornell was. So by the 1960s, art in general was moving further away from being object or even product driven to being concept driven. And one result of this was a movement in the 1960s called minimalism. The work of Robert Morris is an excellent example and one of my favorites, because here's this wooden box. His sculpture's a wooden box. The box itself isn't particularly impressive. In fact, anybody with basic carpentry skills could probably make a box just as good and probably even better. But Morris, what he does is he makes a recording of himself while he's building the box. You can see the hammer and the saw sounds and stuff. Then he takes this tape, he places a tape recorder inside the box so that when the viewer is looking at it in the gallery, she can hear the sound of the box being made, hence the title, Box with the Sound of Its Own Making. Think about that. You're looking at an object in the present. You're hearing a series of sounds in the present, but you understand that those sounds, and you understand it, of course, from the title, you understand that those sounds are from the past and describe the box you are seeing, but in a different state, in its past state. Right? Morris gets us to think about the puzzle of time just by looking at a simple box. And that's minimalism, right? Displaying the simplest possible form, right? There's that word again. Form that results in a complex concept, right? How efficient can you be and still make us think about these sort of great artistic ideas? Richard Serra is another sculptor who shares that minimalist aesthetic. House of Cards, for instance, is really all it is just four giant plates, these massive lead plates that are propped up against each other to form a cube. And they're not welded together, they're not really attached, they're just sort of leaned on each other. It's the sheer mass that stabilizes the structure. It's the presence of these just enormous heavy things. It was so stable, in fact, Sarah claimed that you could actually run into it and it wouldn't fall over. You would bounce off of it rather than it falling over. But not that I'm certain that anybody ever actually tried that. So he made these very simple and oftentimes massive and heavy forms. And in 1979 comes around and he creates really one of the most controversial artworks of the day, a piece called Tilted Arc. And as you can see here again, Tilted Arc is really just a giant, massive curved steel wall. Again, that sat freestanding because of the curve and the weight of it. That was placed in the plaza of the Federal Building in New York City. It was a commissioned sculpture by the city in New York to put sculptures all around the city. So the work becomes really controversial, but it's not because it depicted any offensive subject matter or anything like that, right? But it's because Sarah stuck a giant wall right in front of everyone's commute. People were so annoyed that they had to walk a few hundred extra feet to get from their subway stop to their office building that they complained bitterly. A petition was circulated asking that the sculpture be moved to a less disruptive location, put it in a park somewhere. And here's the way the work becomes historically significant. Because Sarah argues that this sculpture could not be moved because it only is a work of art. It only has artistic meaning in the place where he put it. If you move it to another location, it would no longer express its artistic concept, right? It would just be a big pointless wall if it was off in the corner of some park somewhere. Now that's a provocative idea, and it leads to a movement known as site-specific sculpture, where the context of a place a work of art is installed becomes part of the meaning of that work, right? Think about that, right? Laocoon and his sons. Remember that Greek sculpture where the priest and his boys are fighting off those serpents, right? Well, that should be really as powerful and meaningful if you see it in this museum or that museum, or even if you buy it and you put it in your living room, right? But site-specific sculpture is meant to activate its artistic meaning only in one place, only in the place that it's envisioned to be. It's another good example. Consider Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which is really one of the era's great examples of site-specific sculpture. And it's also a great example of what would become known as earthworks. This was during the early environmental movement. And the earthworks were really sculptures that used only natural elements, natural materials, used typically from the nearby environment. So to make Spiral Jetty, Smithson goes out there and he picks up a rock. He walks out into the water, he drops the rock in the water, walks back, picks up another rock, walks back to the first rock and drops the other one in. And I'm probably exaggerating a little bit there. I think he had a crew and stuff, but he does this over the course of 6 days. And eventually Spiral Jetty reaches 15 feet wide and 1,500 feet long if you walk along the spiral. So it's this massive sort of jetty out into the middle of, it's actually located in a remote northeastern shore of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And it exists to this day. Though actually soon after it was built, it was completely submerged by the lake, and it remained underwater for about 30 years. Then about 2002, a drought took hold and it reemerged. And from what I hear, I haven't heard of it lately, but apparently that area now is actually completely dry because the waters have receded. But that's an important concept for the sculpture and for those that are known as earthworks, right? That they be subject to the natural forces of their environment, right? In many ways, they're not built to last, right? They're built to be part of the world. And it reflects Morris's box as well, if you think about it, because time, again, seems to become part of the artistic medium that forms and changes the work of art. Before the 20th century, that just wasn't something that sculptors considered. And that brings us to the last artist I want to talk about today. Really the contemporary masters, I think, of large-scale, site-specific outdoor work. And they're the sculptors Jean Claude, I should say, and her husband, Christo. And as you can see here, they did things on a monumental scale. And just picture yourself, you work in the city of Miami, you drive to work every day over this bridge in the background maybe, and you look out and there's these couple of islands. And there you go one day, out of nowhere, right? These two little islands that you pass each morning, they're surrounded by these massive pink floating tarps. I mean, how would you react to that, right? You'd be curious, of course. You might be a little alarmed, But you'd ask those questions, right? Why are they out there? What's going on? Why did the world change so drastically? And that's, of course, the purpose of Jean-Claude and Christo's work, right? They mean to change the ordinary world so that we can sort of see it or consider it in a new way. It's supposed to be sort of surprising, alarming. Ultimately, I think, of course, beautiful, but it changes our ordinary experience of a place, and one we may have many times over, into a different experience entirely. One of the first major works that they did this was the Valley Curtain, which is, you can see here, this giant orange curtain that was strung across a valley in Colorado. And again, meant to just sort of be drive by and go, what's that? Their work, The Wrapped Reichstag, is an example of the monumental effort that their work normally requires. Now notice that the date of this artwork is from 1971 to 1995, 24 years, right? It didn't take 24 years to wrap the thing, but it did take 24 years to get permission, to get all the permits, to have this massive cloak, designed and built. It's a huge process, right? So it's really, if you think about it, Jean-Claude and Christo's work is more akin to like a massive public project, like building a bridge, right, than it is to sort of a traditional making of a sculpture. Wrapped Reichstag actually also really becomes Jean-Claude and Christo's most famous works, in part because it's one of the few that had a presumed political meaning. They tend to stay away from politics and current events and stuff, but perhaps by coincidence, and you might be familiar, if you know your German history, you might know that the Reichstag is a site that figures into the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. There was a mysterious arson fire set there, and the Nazis used that as an excuse. This may sound like today, they claim that the liberals were getting violent and that they needed to restore order, although they never did find out who actually set the fire. And so, after World War II, of course, the Reichstag sat for decades, and it really became a disused symbol. My notes say here, a disused symbol of the contrition and shame of Germany for their role in World War II. And it sat virtually abandoned really up until the 1980s, when they finally decided to sort of restore it. And many, because of it being soon after wrapped, they saw Jean-Claude and Christo's cloaking of the Reichstag, of concealing it, if you think, to be a political statement. And I'm not sure they intended it to be so. And it bears really noting that the motif of wrapping large monuments in architecture is something they've actually done throughout their careers. But by far their most famous work, I think, is the Umbrellas, which is a site-specific work, maybe to me because it's one I got to see. Site-specific sculpture that was installed simultaneously in two places, one in Japan and one in California. And as you can see in this case, on each side of the Pacific, the installation consisted of what looked like beach umbrellas, although they were much larger in scale. They were nearly 19 feet tall and about 28 feet in diameter. And as you can see here, hundreds were installed, and in these random patterns in a field of view that stretched for about 6 to 8 miles, that corresponded usually to a major road or a highway or something like that. And in Japan, the umbrellas were blue, while in California, they were yellow. And these were installed on the interstate between the Bay Area and Los Angeles, and they were generally around Bakersfield, California. Now, I was a graduate. I was in graduate school at the San Francisco Art Institute in 1991. So, of course, one weekend we had to pile into the car and drive down I-5 so that we could see it for ourselves. And again, just like that idea about the commute in Miami, I told you, it was a drive I'd made several times before. A lot of people do because, you travel between LA and San Francisco for business and pleasure all the time. So the landscape's a familiar one and quite beautiful in many places. But the transformation as you drive over that first hill and then suddenly you see the whole landscape festooned with these umbrellas is pretty remarkable. So the work really, Jean-Claude and Jean-Claude, I always say Jean because it's French, Jean-Claude and Christo allow us to really look at the world in the space that we're familiar with in a new way. And that's really the final concept of modern sculpture that I wanted to discuss today. Sculpture before the 20th century can really be defined as three-dimensional art objects in space, right? Through the 20th century, though, it really moves closer to making place, and I say that with a capital P, place itself the medium and material of sculpture. And think of it this way, take these umbrellas, right? If you walk up to them and, you're not going to admire the beauty of an exquisitely made umbrella. That's not really the point, right? Their point is that they're made to alert you to how they've changed the world, the spaces where you encounter them, right? Your experience of place, again with that capital P, place is idealized, right? Not your experience of viewing a particular object. Now, sadly, the umbrella exhibition had to be moved early due to a tragic accident. It turned out that people did enjoy getting out of their cars and looking at the umbrellas, walking up to the nearest one to get a better look. One day there were really bad gusty winds, which wasn't uncommon in that area. But one of these massive umbrellas toppled in a gust and killed one of these admirers. And out of respect and caution, Jean-Claude and Christo had them removed as soon as possible for that reason. So, and there were rumors of lawsuits and settlements, but that brings us actually to an interesting point. All of Jean-Claude and Christo's work is enormously expensive, as you can see, if we talked about with the Raptor Reichstag. But they famously never got artist grants or other types of funding to make their work, and they don't sell their work. Read also that they never even took volunteer labor to build the things. They paid everybody. So they were enormously expensive projects. They didn't charge admission fees, right? It's all out there in the world for us to drive by and happen across for free. Christo claims that the artworks that he sold in the 50s and 60s as a younger artist before this period created for him an enormous wealth that he now spends making his current work. And that's actually one of the ideas we'll address in our upcoming discussion, right? How do we value a work of art? What if a work of art is just an experience we have? That seems to be what happens, right, when you see Jean-Claude and Christo's work. But we can't assign a monetary value to it like we do the Mona Lisa, which by late reports is probably worth nearly $1 billion in these days, right? So how do we know what Jean-Claude and Christo's work is worth? I was going to end there, but I got a little epitaph for you. You might be interested to know that Christo's latest work, and now it's Christo alone now because Jean-Claude died in 2009, but it was postponed due to COVID-19. Like the Reichstag, Christo was scheduled to wrap the Arc de Triomphe in Paris right about now, actually. It was supposed to happen in fall 2020. But soon after the outbreak, it was announced that it would be postponed, and soon after that, Christo died in New York City. And while his death incidentally coincided with the worst days of the pandemic in New York, Christo's family insists that he did die of natural causes. So the wrapping of the Arc has actually been postponed until fall 2021, but as of now, we're not sure if it's going to happen.